My name is Robert Callahan. I am 59 years old, and 11 months ago, I bought a one-way ticket to Lisbon, blocked every phone number I'd memorized over the last 3 decades, and left. No note, no explanation, no forwarding address. Last week, my daughter found me in a magazine. I want to tell you the whole story, not the version that makes me the hero of it, and not the version that makes me the villain. The actual version, the one where the truth is distributed unevenly across everyone involved, and none of it is simple, and the ending is not resolved yet, in the way that endings in stories are supposed to be resolved. But first, I need to tell you who I was before I left, because that is the part nobody knew. Let me start with the house. We lived in Naperville, Illinois, a 5-bedroom house on a street where every house was a 5-bedroom house, on a street that looked like the other streets because the developer had decided in 1994 that variation was a liability. I had bought that house in 1998 with my then-wife Linda, when our oldest, Claire, was 4 years old, and our son Marcus was 18 months. And Linda was pregnant with Jess, our youngest, who arrived 6 weeks after we moved in and screamed for what I remember as approximately 3 years without stopping. I worked in commercial lending, 31 years in commercial lending, most of it at a regional bank in the Chicago area, where I rose from loan officer to regional vice president of commercial credit over the course of 2 decades through the specific combination of accurate judgment, a tolerance for risk analysis that most people find genuinely boring, and the willingness to show up on time every single day regardless of what was happening at home. And things happened at home. Linda and I divorced when Jess was 11. It was not dramatic. I want to say that plainly, because divorced parents are often portrayed in a specific way in these stories, as combatants, as people who use their children as weapons. In a war, neither of them was willing to admit they had started. Linda and I were not that. We were 2 people who had built a reasonable life together, and then, sometime around the year my youngest started middle school, looked at each other across the kitchen and understood with the calm clarity of a mutual audit that we had become excellent co-administrators of a household and had stopped being anything else. We separated on a Tuesday and told the kids on a Thursday, and the paperwork was done by February. Linda is a good woman. We see each other at graduations and Christmas and occasionally at Jess's apartment for dinner, and we are pleasant to each other in the way of people who share a history and have elected to carry it without drama. After the divorce, I moved into an apartment in Naperville, and then 2 years later into a house 4 miles from the family house, because I wanted a yard, and I had always wanted a workshop in the back, and the apartment building had a policy about power tools that I found unreasonable. I built the workshop myself over a summer, working weekends, and it became the place I went when I needed to think. I built furniture in that workshop. A dining table for Claire when she got her first apartment, bookshelves for Marcus when he moved to Denver, a rocking chair for Jess that she said she loved and that I later found in her storage unit. But that is getting ahead of things. My children were, for most of their adult lives, the primary structure of my existence outside work. I attended everything. I want to be specific about this, because I am aware that fathers are often described as absent in these stories, and I was not absent. I was at Claire's college graduation and her law school graduation, and both of her bar admissions. I was at Marcus's wedding in Denver and at the hospital when his son, my grandson Owen, was born. and I held that boy for 45 minutes in a hospital chair while Marcus slept in the chair across the room, and I thought, this is what the whole thing has been for. I was at Jess's art shows, all of them. The small ones in the back of coffee shops when she was 23 and didn't have enough work to fill a wall properly, and the larger ones later when she started getting some attention, and the galleries had actual lighting and people came with wine glasses and opinions. I was at Jess's art shows, and I stood in front of her paintings, and I tried to understand them, and sometimes I did, and sometimes I did not, and I always told her they were extraordinary. And I meant it even when I was not sure I understood what I was looking at. I was present. That is what I need you to understand before the rest of this makes any sense. I was not a man who missed things. I was a man who showed up. So I need to tell you about the 3 years before I left, because that is the part that matters. And it is the part I have spent 11 months in Lisbon thinking about with the specific obsessiveness of a person who has nothing but time and a good enough apartment and a café around the corner that serves coffee so much better than anything I had in 30 years in Illinois that it reorganized my understanding of what coffee was. It started, or I noticed it starting, around 3 years before I bought the ticket. Claire was 40 at the time. Marcus was 37. Jess was 35. They all had their own lives in the way that adult children have their own lives, which is to say the lives were full and busy, and the available space for a retired father was specific and bounded, and I understood that, and I did not resent it. What I did not understand, and what took me about a year to fully recognize, was that the available space was shrinking. It started with small things, phone calls that went to voicemail and were not returned for 3 or 4 days, plans that were made and then postponed and then quietly not remade. Christmas, which had always been at the family house and then at Linda's house after the divorce and then rotating between the kids, became for 2 years in a row a thing that was discussed in group text messages with a great deal of apparent intention and then resolved in a way that did not involve me. The first year, I thought it was logistics. The second year, I started to wonder. I was not left out explicitly. I was not told I was not wanted. Nobody sat me down and said, "Dad, we are moving on from regular contact with you." What happened was quieter than that, and in the way of quiet things, harder to name and harder to address. I was included in the group texts. I was invited to things with what felt like adequate notice. But the quality of the inclusion had changed. It had become the inclusion of someone being managed rather than someone being wanted. Does that distinction make sense? I did not know how to say it at the time. I know how to say it now because I have had 11 months to find the words. I was being handled, and the handling came from a specific place, I think, which was that I had retired. 18 months before the ticket, 31 years in commercial lending, my last 5 as a regional VP. And then I retired at 57 because the bank had a reorganization, and the reorganization created an early retirement package that was genuinely good, and I had enough in the pension and the savings in the house to be fine. And so I took it. I thought retiring would make me more available to them. I thought, freed from the structure of work, I would have more time for the things that actually mattered, and I would use that time, and the relationships would deepen, because I would finally be present in the way. I had not always been present when I was working 60 hours a week and traveling twice a month. What actually happened was that without the structure of work, I lost the identity that had made me legible to the world. I did not understand this at the time. I understand it now. When you spend 31 years as the VP of commercial credit at a regional bank, you have a role. The role gives you a context. When someone at a dinner party asks what you do, you answer, and the answer produces a reaction, and the reaction tells you something about your position in the social order. I was not someone who cared deeply about that order, but I had not understood, until I left it, how much of my own self-understanding had been structured by it. After I retired, when someone asked what I did, I said I was retired. And I watched the conversation adjust, not rudely, never rudely, just the small recalibration that people make when they realize the person they are talking to is not going to be a professional resource or a social connection in any transactional sense. I was an older man who was retired. I was present but finished. I was being managed. My children did not do this consciously. I want to say that with as much certainty as I can manage, which is a fair amount, because I know my children, and they are good people who would be genuinely distressed to hear themselves described as managing their father. But I also know that behavior does not require consciousness to cause harm. They were busy. They had full lives. And in the hierarchy of things that deserved their attention, a retired father who was fine, who had enough money and a workshop in the backyard and no apparent crisis, was simply not near the top. The rocking chair I built for Jess, the one I found in her storage unit, was the moment I knew something had shifted in a way I could no longer attribute to logistics or busyness or the ordinary friction of adult lives moving in different directions. I found it because I was helping her move. She had asked me, which felt like progress, like a restoration of the kind of ordinary functional relationship I had been missing. I drove to Chicago with the truck. We spent a Saturday moving boxes. At some point, I went into the storage unit to drop something off, and there it was, in the back. Behind boxes she had clearly not opened in 2 years. The rocking chair I had spent 3 months building, the one I had finished and sanded until the surface was so smooth it felt like it had been made by a machine. The one I had driven to Chicago in a rented van on a Tuesday because I was not willing to risk a scratch in the back of a regular car. She had not thrown it away. That was something, I supposed. She had put it in storage, which in a certain kind of accounting was nearly the same thing. I did not say anything. I moved the boxes I had come to move. I drove the truck back to the house. I said goodbye to Jess in the parking lot of her building, and she said, "Dad, thanks. I could not have done this without you." And she hugged me, and I hugged her back, and I drove home. I sat in my workshop that evening for a long time without turning on any of the tools. Over the following 8 months, I tried. I want that on record because I know how this story sounds, and I know the version people tell themselves about men who disappear, and I want you to know that I tried before I disappeared. I called more. I suggested plans with specificity, not vague, let's get together energy, but actual dates and actual times and actual activities with enough lead time that nobody could say they hadn't had enough notice. I drove to Denver to see Marcus and Owen without being invited because I had read somewhere that waiting to be invited was how parents ended up never seeing their grandchildren, and that trip was genuinely good. We had 2 good days. Marcus and I took Owen to the zoo, and Marcus and I had a real conversation at dinner the second night about what retirement was like and whether I was okay. And I told him honestly that I was finding it harder than I had expected, and he said, "Dad, you just need to find your thing. You'll figure it out." You just need to find your thing. I drove home from Denver thinking about that sentence. It was kind. Marcus is a kind man. He said it with genuine warmth and not a trace of dismissal in his voice. And it was also in the particular way of advice given by someone who has not been listening carefully enough, almost completely useless. I did not need to find my thing. I had things. I had the workshop. I had the reading I had been doing, history mostly, infrastructure history oddly enough, the kind of deep reading that work had never given me time for. I had the house. I had my health mostly, the usual catalog of minor complaints that accumulate past 50, but nothing that required management. I had enough. What I did not have was the feeling of being wanted by the people I had organized my life around wanting me. And I want to be careful here because I can hear how this sounds. A man in his late 50s who feels unloved by his adult children and buys a one-way ticket to Lisbon sounds, in a certain telling, like a man who is having a crisis and make it everyone else's problem. I am aware of that reading. I spent a good deal of time in the months before I left examining it, turning it over, trying to determine whether what I was feeling was real, or whether it was the particular distortion of a man whose identity had been destabilized by retirement and who was projecting something internal onto the people around him. I could not determine this to a certainty. I still cannot. The honest answer is probably both. But I can tell you what the last 3 months before I left felt like. Jess's birthday was in March. I sent a gift, a good one, something she had mentioned wanting the previous fall, a specific book of photographs by a Portuguese photographer she admired. I had actually remembered. I had written it down in October when she mentioned it, and I ordered it in February so it would arrive on time. She sent a text that said, "Thanks, Dad, this is great," with 2 exclamation points and an emoji, and I did not hear from her again for 6 weeks. Claire's family came through Naperville in April on the way to her in-laws in Wisconsin. They stopped for 3 hours. I cooked lunch. The kids ran in the yard. Claire's husband, a man named Patrick, who I genuinely like, helped me move something heavy in the workshop, and we talked for 20 minutes about a project I was building, a blanket chest for Owen. And those 20 minutes were the best 20 minutes of the visit, because Patrick was actually asking questions and looking at the work. Claire spent most of the 3 hours on her phone. When they left, she hugged me at the door and said, "Dad, we should do a longer visit soon," and I said yes, we should. And I watched them drive away, and I knew that soon was not a real word. Marcus called in May to say that he and the family were going to Cabo for Father's Day with his wife's parents, and he was sorry. He knew it was Father's Day. They would do something later in the summer. I said, of course, have a great trip. I spent Father's Day building the blanket chest for Owen by myself in the workshop, and I was fine. I was genuinely fine. But fine is not the same as okay, and I had begun to understand the difference. In June, I went to my doctor for a regular checkup, and he asked me, as doctors do, how I was doing beyond the physical. I told him the truth, which I had not told anyone else. I said I was finding it hard to locate myself in a life that had been reorganized around a role I no longer had. He looked at me for a moment, and then he said, "Robert, do you have anything that is entirely yours, not shared, not given to someone else, something that belongs to you completely?" I thought about the workshop. I thought about the furniture I built and gave away. I thought about the reading, which I did alone, but which I had not yet told anyone about, because it had not come up in the kind of conversations I was having with my children, the surface conversations, the "how are you" and the "thanks for the gift" conversations. I said, "I'm not sure." He said, "That's the thing to find. Not for them. For you." I drove home, and I sat in the workshop for a long time, and I thought about that. 2 weeks later, in the middle of July, I was at Claire's for a birthday party for her older daughter. A backyard party, a dozen children, parents standing around with drinks in the way of suburban Saturday afternoons. A woman I had never met asked who I was. I said I was Claire's father. She looked at me with the polite warmth of someone making necessary conversation and said, "Oh, what do you do?" I said I was retired. She said, "Oh, lovely," and turned to talk to someone else. I stood in Claire's backyard with a glass of lemonade, and I thought about the question my doctor had asked me, and I thought about the Portuguese photographer's book sitting on a shelf in Jess's apartment, probably unread, and I thought about the rocking chair in the storage unit, and I thought about Marcus saying, "You just need to find your thing." And I thought about a sentence I had read the previous month in a book about the construction of the Panama Canal, about the chief engineer writing in his journal that the only thing that made him feel fully present was standing at the edge of a thing that was being built and knowing that he understood completely. I stood in Claire's backyard and I thought, I understand almost nothing about my current life, not because it was complicated, because it was too simple, because I had retired into a life where the most meaningful relationship I had was with a piece of oak furniture in a workshop that nobody but me ever entered. I left the party early. I said I had another engagement, which was not true. I drove home. I went into the workshop. I sat on the stool I kept near the bench, and I looked at the blanket chest for Owen, 3/4 finished, and I asked myself a question I had not asked before. What would happen if I left? Not in a dramatic way, not the angry version of leaving, not a statement or a gesture or a way of making anyone feel something, just what would actually happen if I was not here, not gone in the permanent sense, just gone somewhere else, a place that had nothing to do with the last 30 years. The honest answer, when I examined it clearly, was probably nothing would change for a while. Claire would notice at some point, Marcus would notice, Jess would notice eventually, but the daily structure of their lives, the actual texture of their weeks, would not be meaningfully different because I was not in Naperville. That answer scared me, not because it made me angry, because it made me understand that I had become optional in the lives of the people for whom I had always felt essential. And that understanding, once it arrived, did not leave. I spent 6 weeks after that researching Lisbon, not because I had always wanted to go to Lisbon specifically, though I had been there once for 4 days in 2009 on a layover that became an extension when I discovered the city was the most unexpectedly beautiful place I had ever stood in. I chose Lisbon because I could afford it, because the cost of living made my retirement income substantial instead of adequate, because there was an English-speaking community large enough to be useful, but not so large that I could avoid learning Portuguese, and because when I stood in front of a picture of the light on the Tagus River on a Tuesday afternoon in July in Naperville, Illinois, something in me that had been very quiet for a long time said yes. I booked a one-way ticket on a Thursday in August. The flight was in 3 weeks. I told my banker. I arranged for the house to be looked after by a property management company. I gave my neighbor, a man named Dave, who I had trusted with a spare key for 11 years, a brief and honest explanation. I was going abroad for an extended period. I did not know when I would be back. He should feel free to use the garden tools. He looked at me for a moment, and then he said, "Good for you, Robert." And he meant it. And it was the most straightforwardly kind thing anyone said to me in the month before I left. I did not tell my children I want to examine that decision because it is the one that most people hearing this story will find the hardest to understand, and I want to be as honest about it as I can be. I did not tell them because I knew what would happen if I did. Claire would be alarmed efficiently. She would shift into management mode, the specific gear she operates in when something needs to be resolved, and she would resolve it by being present and attentive for 3 to 4 weeks and then returning to her normal orbit once the alarm had passed. Marcus would be concerned from a distance and would express that concern in phone calls that were warm and slightly insufficient. Jess would feel guilty and produce the guilt as emotion in a way that would require me to manage her reaction to my situation, which was the opposite of what I needed. What I needed was to leave without the leaving becoming about them. So I blocked their numbers and their emails and every channel through which they might reach me. And I went to the airport on a Tuesday morning in August with 2 large suitcases and a carry-on, and I flew to Lisbon. The first 3 days were the strangest days of my adult life. I had rented an apartment in the Moraria neighborhood, close to the old city, up the kind of hill that Lisbon specializes in, the kind where the streets are too narrow for cars and the buildings are tiled in blue and white azulejos that have been there for 150 years and look like they intend to be there for another 150. The apartment was small, 1 bedroom, a kitchen that required attention to navigate without turning sideways, a living room with a window that looked out over the rooftops to the river in the distance. I sat in that apartment for the first 3 days, and I did nothing except walk to the café around the corner and drink coffee and come back and sit by the window. On the 4th day, I found a language school and enrolled in a Portuguese class. That was the beginning. I want to tell you about the 11 months because they matter as much as the 3 years before them. The 3 years were the thing I was leaving. The 11 months were the thing I was moving toward, and the distinction between those two, which I did not understand clearly when I got on the plane, became the most important thing I learned in Lisbon. The Portuguese class was 3 mornings a week, 2 hours each, in a small school on a side street in Chiado. There were 7 students in my level, a young woman from Brazil who was learning European Portuguese for work reasons, and found the differences intensely frustrating, a retired British couple who were planning to apply for residency and treated the classes like a competitive sport they intended to win, a software engineer from South Korea who was working remotely and had chosen Lisbon because of the time zone and the light, and 2 other Americans, one of whom was my age and one of whom was about 30, and working for a startup, and seemed permanently bewildered by the concept of a grammar lesson. I was not good at Portuguese. I want to say that clearly because sometimes these stories involve people discovering hidden talents. And I did not discover a hidden talent for Portuguese. I discovered that learning a language at 59 is approximately 4 times harder than learning it at 25 and approximately twice as interesting. I worked harder at it than I had worked at anything since my first year in commercial lending, when I had been genuinely afraid of failing, and that fear had organized me completely. The working at something that was difficult did something to me. Within 3 weeks of starting the class, I was sleeping better than I had slept in a year. Within 6 weeks, I had learned enough Portuguese to have a functional conversation with the man who ran the café, whose name was Antonio, and who had strong opinions about football and about the correct temperature at which to serve a particular kind of local wine, and who treated my attempts at his language with the generous patience of a man who has watched a lot of people try and has decided that the trying is what counts. I began to walk. Not exercise walking, not the purposeful walking of a man with a fitness goal, but the old kind of walking, the kind that has no destination and no agenda, the kind where you turn down a street because it looks interesting and end up somewhere you did not know existed. Lisbon is a city built for this kind of walking. It is full of miradouros, viewpoints, places where the street ends in a railing and below you the city falls away to the river and the water and the other bank. And you stand there and think without trying to. I found a woodworking shop 6 weeks after I arrived. A small workshop in a neighborhood called Intendente, run by a man named Jorge, who was 64 and had been making traditional Portuguese furniture for 40 years, and who, when I walked in one afternoon and explained who I was and what I could do and asked whether there was anything I could contribute, looked at my hands for a moment and said, in English, "That was better than my Portuguese. Come back tomorrow at 8. I worked in Jorge's shop 3 days a week for 7 months. I was not paid. That was not the point. The point was the work, the specific kind of work that requires your complete attention and does not leave any part of your mind available for the background noise that had been running in my head for 3 years. Jorge worked on the traditional pieces, the carved and painted furniture that was becoming harder to find craftsmen for as the younger generation moved into other trades. I worked on the joinery, the structural work, fitting and cutting and assembling, with the kind of precision that Jorge said, after the first month, he had not seen in a man who was not trained in Portugal. I told him I had been building furniture in a workshop in Illinois for 15 years. He said, "Then you were already a carpenter. You just did not know it was the main thing." I thought about that sentence for several days. I want to tell you something about the workshop that I have not told anyone yet. Not Jess in her emails, not Marcus when he called, not Claire when she asked how I had been spending my time. The first thing I built in Jorge's shop, on my own time, on a Saturday when the rest of the workshop was quiet and Jorge had gone to visit his sister in the Alentejo and left me a key because he trusted me the way craftsmen trust each other, which is the most complete form of trust I have encountered in a professional context, was a rocking chair. Not a copy of the one I had built for Jess, not an attempt to replicate it or to replace it or to resolve anything. A different chair, designed differently, built from a different wood, with different proportions and a different intention. I built it because I needed to build something that was mine, in the purest sense, not a gift, not a project with a recipient, not furniture in service of someone else's life. A thing I made because I wanted to make it, because the design existed in my head, and the wood was there, and the morning was long and quiet. It took 4 Saturdays, When it was done, I put it in the corner of the living room in the apartment in Muraria, next to the window that looked out over the rooftops. I sit in it sometimes in the early mornings before the Portuguese class or the walk to the workshop, with coffee, watching the light change on the buildings across the street. The tiles on the buildings across the street catch light differently as the sun moves, going from gray to cream to a particular warm white that only happens between 7:30 and 8 in the morning and then is gone. I have sat in that chair and watched that light enough times that I have started to feel the way you feel about something that belongs completely to you. The workshop did something else for me, too. In the 5th month, I had a conversation with a man named Tiago, who was an apprentice in Jorge's shop, 22 years old, learning the trade the old way, at someone's side over years, not in a school, but in a room with wood and tools and the daily instruction of someone who has been doing it for 40 years. Tiago was serious and quick and had the specific alertness of a young person who is genuinely interested in what they are learning, rather than merely going through the motions of acquiring a credential. He asked me one afternoon, in the careful English he was practicing whenever I was present, how I had learned to do the kind of joinery I did. I told him I had taught myself, from books and from making mistakes and from taking apart pieces of old furniture I found at estate sales, to understand how they were made. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That is a long way to learn something. Why did you not find a teacher?" I told him I had not thought of myself as someone learning a craft. I had thought of myself as someone doing a hobby. He looked at me with the expression of a 22-year-old who is trying to be polite about something he finds genuinely confusing. He said, "But you are not a hobbyist. You are a carpenter. I could see it the first day you walked in." I have thought about that conversation many times, not because it was flattering, though it was, because it articulated something that I had not been able to articulate myself. I had spent 15 years building furniture in a workshop in Illinois, and I had never once applied to myself the word that Tiago used in his second language on a Tuesday afternoon in Lisbon: carpenter. Not a banker who builds furniture on weekends. Not a retired man with a hobby. A carpenter who had spent 31 years in banking. That is a different sentence. The subject is different. And the subject, I think, is the thing. In the 4th month, Jorge introduced me to a man named Enrique Faria. Enrique was a cultural journalist, 60s, who wrote about Portuguese craft and traditional industry for a magazine called Arte e Ofício, which translated roughly to Art and Craft. He was doing a piece on Jorge's workshop and the question of traditional furniture making in contemporary Lisbon. He came in one morning with a photographer and spent 4 hours watching us work and asking questions. At some point, his questions turned to me. Who was I? Where had I come from? What was I doing here? I told him the honest version, or a version of it. A retired banker from the American Midwest who had come to Lisbon because he needed to find out what he was when he was not a banker, and had found, rather to his own surprise, that he was mostly a carpenter. Enrique laughed. Then he asked if he could include me in the piece. I said yes, without thinking about it. The magazine piece ran in the 6th month. I did not think about it much. I had not subscribed to any particular outcome when I agreed to be included. I answered the questions honestly and sat still for the photographs and went back to the work. 3 weeks after it ran, Enrique emailed to say the piece had been picked up by several online outlets, and that one of them, an English-language publication about expat life in Southern Europe, had republished it with an emphasis on my part of the story specifically. He sent me the link. I read it. There was a photograph of me at Jorge's bench in profile, fitting a tenon joint, with light coming in from the window on the left, the way light comes into that workshop in the mornings, direct and golden and completely without sentiment. I thought, I look like a man who knows what he is doing. I had not thought that about myself in a long time. I did not contact my children. I want to be honest about this because by the 6th month, the decision to maintain the silence was no longer simply the decision I had made at the beginning. It had become something I was actively choosing, day by day, to continue. I thought about them. I thought about them often. I thought about Owen, who would be walking now and probably talking, who would be changing in all the ways that children change between 2 and 3 that are not reversible and that you cannot get back if you miss them. I thought about Claire, and whether she was well, and whether Patrick was well, and whether the life she had built was making her happy. In the real sense, and not just the functional sense. I thought about Marcus in Denver, and whether he had finished the deck he had been planning to add to the back of his house. I thought about Jess, and whether her last show had gone well, and whether she had read the photograph book, and whether the rocking chair was still in the storage unit. I thought about them with the clear-eyed ache of someone who is no longer arranging his life around making them comfortable with him. That was the thing that had changed. I was not trying to be comfortable to them anymore. I was just living, and the living had turned out to be very full. In the 9th month, Jorge asked me if I would want to take over a section of the workshop that dealt with restoration work. Older pieces brought in by museums and private collectors that needed structural repair without altering their historical character. It was meticulous work, the kind that requires you to understand what someone made 100 years ago well enough to complete what they left incomplete or repair what time had damaged while leaving their intentions entirely intact. I said yes, I was good at it. Jorge said I was excellent at it, which from Jorge was the equivalent of a standing ovation because Jorge did not distribute praise with any generosity. I spent 3 months doing restoration work, and it was the most satisfied I had been in a professional context since the year I turned 40, and understood, for the first time, that I was genuinely good at my job. In the 10th month, on a Sunday afternoon in June, I was sitting in a small restaurant near the apartment eating lunch by myself, which I had by that point entirely normalized as an activity and even come to prefer in certain moods, when my phone lit up with an email from an address I did not recognize. The subject line said, "Dad, is this you?" It was from Jess. She had created a new email address, something neutral and uninflected, and she had sent one sentence and a link. The link was to the English language expat piece, the photograph of me at the bench. I sat in the restaurant for a long time without moving. I thought about what I wanted to do, not the reflexive answer, the one that arrives before you have had time to actually think. I sat with it the way I had learned to sit with things in 11 months of having enough quiet to actually think. I wrote back. I said, yes, it is me. I am in Lisbon. I am well. I am working in a furniture restoration workshop, and I am learning Portuguese, badly but sincerely. I am not ready to explain everything, but I want you to know I am okay. I have been okay. I am more than okay, she replied within 4 minutes. She said, Dad, we have been looking for you for 7 months. Claire hired someone. We didn't know if you were alive. I read that sentence twice. I want to tell you what that sentence did to me because it would be easy to tell this story in a way that makes it triumphant at this point. The father who left and was found and was proven to have been missed, the absence that revealed the love. I do not think it was that simple. The truth is that reading Jess's sentence produced in me something more complicated than relief. It produced grief, the specific grief of a man who understands that the thing he needed to do for himself caused real pain to people he loves, and that the two things can both be true and neither one cancels the other. I wrote back and told her I was sorry for the silence and that I had not intended to frighten them, and that the blocking had been about protecting the space to leave and not about punishing them for anything, and that I understood if they were angry. She wrote back and said, I don't think we're angry. I think we're ashamed. I sat with that for a long time, too. We talked. Not that day, not a phone call. I was not ready for that yet, and I told her so, and she understood, which surprised me, but Jess has always understood things at the level just beneath the stated thing. It is one of the reasons her paintings are as good as they are. We talked through email over the following 2 weeks, Jess, and then Marcus, and then eventually Claire, who took longer because Claire processes things by organizing them, and it took her a while to find the organizational framework for what had happened. Marcus said, Dad, I think about the Denver trip all the time. I said you just need to find your thing. I didn't know you already knew what it was. I just couldn't see it. Claire said, Dad, I need you to tell me if we did something specific. I need to know what we did wrong so I can fix it. I told her I did not think it was about specific things. I told her the honest version, the version I have been telling you, the gradual becoming optional, the quiet erosion of being seen, the rocking chair in the storage unit, which I mentioned because I needed to mention it, and which produced from Claire a silence that lasted 2 days before she wrote back and said, I knew. Jess told me she'd put it in storage. I should have said something. I didn't. I don't know why I didn't. I think I thought it wasn't my business. I was wrong. Jess wrote separately about the rocking chair. She said, I didn't know what to do with the feeling of every time I sat in it. I felt guilty for not being as available to you as you'd been to me. So I put it away. That was cowardly. I'm sorry, Dad. I read that email in the café, at my usual table, with Antonio behind the counter watching me with the particular attentiveness of a man who has been watching people think in his café for 20 years. He brought me a glass of water without being asked. I think my face was doing something. I have not gone back to Naperville, not yet. I want to be precise about this because I know the expected ending is the return, the reconciliation in an airport or a driveway, the restored family gathered around a table somewhere. That has not happened. I am still in Lisbon. I am still at Jorge's workshop 3 days a week. I am still walking through neighborhoods I have not been through before, and finding miraduros I did not know existed, and standing at railings above the river at various times of day, and finding that the light is always different and always worth stopping for. Claire is coming in 2 weeks. Just Claire, without Patrick or the kids. A deliberate choice she made, she said, because she wanted to talk without managing anyone else's experience at the same time. I told her I would cook. She said she remembered I cooked badly and she was coming anyway. I told her I had gotten better. She said she would believe it when she tasted it. Marcus is talking about bringing his family in the fall. Owen will be 3 by then. I think about Owen in Lisbon. I think about a 3-year-old standing at a railing above the Tagus, looking at the water the way 3-year-olds look at large things, with the complete absence of any framework for understanding what they are seeing, and therefore with total openness to it. Jess sent me a photograph she took last week of a detail from a painting she's working on. Just a detail, a small section of the larger thing. She said, I'm working on a series about absence and what it makes visible. She said, I think you'd understand it now better than you did before. She is right. I would. I am not the same man who stood in Claire's backyard in July holding a glass of lemonade and feeling the particular loneliness of a person who has become furniture in the lives of the people he loves. I am not that man. I do not know with certainty whether I will go back to the house in Naperville or whether Lisbon has become the thing, the main thing, the place where the version of me that was always there but unscheduled has found its footing. I do not know whether my children and I will build something different from what we had, or whether we will rebuild what we had, or whether it will be some third thing I cannot currently imagine. What I know is what my doctor asked me in June of last year, the question that I could not answer then and can answer now. He asked if I had anything that was entirely mine. I do now. I have a workbench in a shop in Intendente with a view of a courtyard where a lemon tree grows against a white wall. I have Antonio's coffee and Antonio's honest silence when I need it, and Antonio's occasional strong opinion about football when I do not. I have a language that is still 3/4 beyond me, but that gives ground slowly and rewards the patience. I have mornings that are mine before they belong to anything else, completely and without negotiation. I have the photograph from the magazine, a man at a bench in good light, fitting a joint with his hands, entirely present in the work. I have that. If you have ever disappeared, not dramatically, not angrily, but quietly, from your own life, and if the disappearing was the only way to find out what was actually there, you know what this story is about. Not revenge, not abandonment, the specific and difficult kind of returning to yourself when everything familiar has made you invisible. The work was always there. The man was always there. Sometimes you have to go very far away to see what was standing right behind you. See you in the next one.